All right, so I think when I'm learning a chord progression, probably the most important thing I can work on is voice leading. Getting smoothly from one chord to the next. And I think that's something we can lose sight of when we're working with like functional harmony, particularly like pre 1960 jazz standards and American songbook standards and stuff, because we've got a lot of theory reasons for why these chords like to go together. But at the end of the day, it is voice leading. Like it's always voice leading, in that one chord likes to move, the notes of one chord can be pulled into the notes of the next chord and so on until we get where we want to go. And that's a little more obvious maybe when we work on tunes like Shorter and Herbie Hancock tunes and stuff like that, when like you look at Dolphin Dance or something, and like, voice leading between some of the different parts of these chords is really the only way they could work together. But this is true no matter what we're working on. So voice leading is kind of the first thing that I like to get into. So one of the first things I do is this sort of endless arpeggio exercise, which I never really heard called that until maybe a year or two ago, but it's a cool one. The way that I do this is I pick a range on the guitar, so like a position or something. So I'm gonna pick this position right here, and I'll pick a chord progression that I'm working on. And for me, it's really important that this be a small chord progression, like not a whole tune. Like I've been working on What's New, so I'll do the first couple bars of What's New, not the whole A section, not the whole tune. Um, you know, first few measures of that are like C major 7, B flat minor, E flat 7, A flat major, and then it goes like 2-5 to C minor. But I might just stop there. A flat major 7. That's an interesting move. It's one we see in Lady Bird also. Bridge of Have You Met Miss Jones? So that's part of the reason why working on these small chord progressions is really useful. First of all, it's just practical. If you want to get better at something and it's challenging, you make it slower or you make it smaller, So making it smaller is a really useful way to like really dig in on something in a way that's trickier to do with the whole tune. The other reason is that I can start recognizing these smaller chord progressions as parts of other tunes. The larger chord progressions, that works too. But obviously, if you're trying to match up a larger part of a chord progression to other tunes, it's going to be harder to find matches, So anyway, pick a chord progression, pick a range. I'm going to use this position right here. It's like 7th position or something. So I'm going to start by just playing arpeggios through the tune. And the idea here is that I start on the lowest note in my range. I go up to the highest note, and then I turn around. And I go back to the lowest, back up to the highest, back to the lowest, back up to the highest. So when I try and voice lead through these chords, what I try and do is each time the chord changes, I try and move to the nearest note in the next chord from where I am now, while also following these range rules. So what that might look like, for example, is if I play C major 7, I'm going to do quarter notes, so 4 notes to the measure. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and I land on B natural here. But the nearest note, I'm going to B flat major 7. I'm closer to B flat. That would be my nearest note. But with the range restriction, I don't want to go backwards until I run out of space. So I'm going to go forwards, up a whole step to D flat. So that's how it kind of works. A flat major, D flat half. I guess I'll stop there. I could do D half the measure to be the next one, but we'll stop there. So. And maybe I'll start on a different note. End up with kind of the same thing. Start on another one. And this doesn't feel like an endless arpeggio exercise because I'm pausing, I'm working on this small chord progression, but I could just say like, okay, I'll do a whole measure of A flat and then I'll just go back to C major or something and kind of make it an endless arpeggio exercise. So like, back to C major. Back to C major. Back to C major. And the reason the range restriction is really useful is because it makes you find links in different places. If you end up doing just to the nearest note every time, then you're going to end up with the same pathways through the tune a lot. But if you force yourself to go by direction, a lot of the times you're going to move to the nearest note, but also a lot of the times you're going to move to another good choice that isn't really the nearest note, and that's totally fine. So that's a great exercise to work on. You can do this with triads. You can do this with Upper structures, I think I don't waste a lot of time doing that. I think that can get pretty heady pretty quickly and impractical, but I might go up to the ninth on stuff. So like for arpeggios, I might take an arpeggio off the root, a seventh chord off the root, or a seventh chord off the third, like that bebop 3 to 9 arpeggio or something. With a triad, I might take triad off the root, triad off the third, triad off the fifth, because that's going to get me, over a C major chord. That'd be G, B, D, takes me up to the ninth. I think that's really practical. Much more than that, I think, can be useful, especially in some more modern tunes, but I don't get there that often. Kind of play with the basic stuff. That's the stuff you end up using more. But after we kind of get a handle on stuff like this, I also think it's really important just to work on guide tone lines. So when we talk about voice leading as a chording instrument, we talk about the smoothest way to get from chord to chord. When we're talking about like a saxophone section or a choir or a brass, the brass section or something like that, the chords are often incidental to the melodies. For example, if I end up with a cool extension on a chord, in a saxophone solo, a lot of the time that's because I don't, for example, want my tenor saxophone to play the root 2 times in a row. So I might just say, okay, instead of playing the root, 2 or 3 times in a row, I'll go root, flat 9, back to root or something. So you end up with the cool extension, but it's incidental to what's going on in the melody. The important part and the thing that makes the chords sound good is that the melodies inside the chords are really smooth. And that's, when we see unusual chords and stuff like that in chord progressions, a lot of the times that's what makes them end up kind of making sense, is that you see that they actually voice lead pretty well. It's like, okay, well, this guy was clearly writing for a pit orchestra and not just for a guitar player to chunk through chords on, So a good way to start getting into this is just to start identifying the chord tones. It's a good way to get the progression in your ear and stuff like that. And it's also just kind of, academic, like brain stuff. Like you got to know where the notes are before you start voice leading. So you might just go through and find the roots of all of your chord progressions. So C, B flat, E flat, A flat. Great. I can do it up here too. C, B flat, E flat, A flat. Great. Might move on to the third. E, D flat, G, C. Do it here too. E, D flat, G, C. The fifths of every chord. So there's G. And I could do these in different places just because it's easier to find this. Multiple octaves even within a position, but I'm not going to keep doing that. So sevenths. Cool. Do the ninths. Ninths can be useful again. But once I've kind of got that going on, what I'm going to do is just work on improvising a little bit with it and trying to find smooth ways to get from one chord to the other. Okay, I'll start on the seventh of my C major chord and see what happens. So 2, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That was cool. 1, 2, 3. Cool. To the other direction. Great. But it's also worth noting that some of these guide tones, some of these chord tones, work better for making guide tone lines. And when we talk about guide tone lines, we're talking about just making those smooth melodies, and we'll get into some more specifics about that in just a second. But it's worth investigating the root and the fifth. First of all, so when I do this, I go, okay, I start on the root here, and if I go just sort of roots and fifths on these chords, I got, root of my C major, root of my B flat, fifth of my E flat 7, root of my A flat. If I start on the fifth, I end up with this. It's lots of stepwise movement, and that's because chords tend to move in cycles of 4, cycles of 5, a lot of sort of stepwise motion of chords, even motion in thirds. You're not jumping that far. And so what we end up with when we're moving between the root and the fifth, because those notes are a fifth or a fourth, depending on direction, away from each other, you end up with lots of common tones, lots of stepwise movement. Super cool. Problem with the roots and the fifths is that they aren't super descriptive of the chords. Of course, when we look at C major 7, C dominant 7, C minor 7, knowing that there's a C in them doesn't tell you anything about the quality of the chord. The difference between those chords is what's going on in the third with the third and the seventh. Major third, major seventh. major third, minor seventh, minor third, minor seventh. So that's what tells us what's going on in the chord. So the thirds and the sevenths are a little more important, and they also happen to be a fifth or a fourth apart. So if we go up from 3 to 7, that's a fifth. If we go up from 7 to 3, that's a fourth. So we're going to get the same sort of stepwise and common tone movement by doing that. So if I start on B natural, I end up with something like this. So B natural is the seventh of my C major, D flat being the third of my B flat minor and the seventh of my E flat major, and then going down to C is the third of my A flat major chord. If I start on E, I end up with something pretty similar. So it ends up being a little tiny bit choppier, but that's okay. So cool. So this is incredibly useful to us. First of all, it's going to get the sound of that chord progression like super in my ears when I work on it this way. But we can also start adding little things to this to start making lines. Things like enclosures and rhythm can be really useful. 1, 2, 3, 4. Cool. But it can also help if we start like sort of working on making some more scalar things kind of happen. So if I sort of work on maybe hitting the third of every chord, but adding a scale note before it. So that means I'm going to add maybe the note, just sort of an ascending scale run. So I want to add the note below my third on the and to 4 of every measure. So instead of playing 1, 2, 3, sorry, it's the seventh. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, I might do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, and there you go, like that. So you see I add that note in there, and then I can start building a scale run off of that. So now I'll add 2 notes before each one. So I want to go down a little lower in my scale, and I want to start on beat 4 rather than the and of beat 4. So 1, 2, 3, 2, 3. Right? Also worth noting, I did that, 2 chords in the measure in that middle measure. So I didn't start on the end of, I didn't start on beat 4. I started on beat 2 and beat 4 to sort of make that work. Anyway, so let's do this again. We'll add another note, 3-note scale run. So we're going to start on the and of beat 3 instead of on beat 4. So 1, 2, 3, 2, 3. We sort of build these scale runs. And as we start being able to kind of build these scale runs out, we can start, again, using the guide tone line. Instead of using just thirds or just sevenths or something like that, we can actually use a voice-led guide tone line to start building little scale runs like that. And it can sort of make our scalar playing a little more targeted, a little more logical. And it really kind of trains you to start being able to like make cool melodies through a chord progression in a way that sounds logical. So that's sort of how I end up taking a lot of this stuff and working on a lot of this stuff. So anyway, that's sort of like most of what I do when I'm working on a chord progression, a little line building and stuff too, but that's a lot of it. So anyway, hopefully that is something that is useful, but who knows?